Brian Olasov has more than 3 decades of strategic business and capital market experience and also an extensive background on real estate capital markets, troubled mortgage loans, and banking challenges. Brian is an expert on the state of residential and commercial mortgage markets, MBS litigation, structured finance products, appraisal and valuation issues, and banking and lending regulations. From 2008 to 2010, Brian served as an adjunct professor at the Emory Law School. He has been a guest lecturer at the graduate real estate programs of Georgia State University, Emory, Columbia University, Georgetown University, and Wharton. Glad you joined us, and this is fantastic. Where am I contacting you in? What city?
My wife and I actually left New York City over the summer, and we're living in Charleston, South Carolina now.
So you've taken up residence in the South. Amazing. That's fantastic. And you love it there?
I love it, and I'm actually returning home. This is where I grew up.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. The thing that we're looking at is since last March, a year ago, we entered this pandemic. And of course, it was just devastating on so many dimensions of human life and existence, the markets, economics, social upheaval, the climate dynamics have just accelerated. There's so many things. And then, of course, we went through a very awful political year as well. And here we find ourselves breathing a bit as 3 to 4 million vaccines a day are now being passed out through the United States. It's really exciting. But I think that we as Americans are more apt to quickly put things in our rearview mirror rather than contemplate what is happening in the rearview mirror. What did we learn?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you, what would be some of the observations and lessons that we should be focused on and not just quickly say, yeah, got that and move on. And I'm thinking particularly around our commercial real estate industry. Were there some lessons learned through this time that are perhaps different than we've seen in prior downturns?
And I would say unequivocally, yes. And you almost have to take it segment by segment to figure out what those impacts are. Some of it is the fact that an older generation that was reluctant to enter into e-commerce found the allure of e-commerce. And there's tantalizing information about how much of that migration away from bricks and mortar retail to e-commerce is durable. There's actually some very recent information indicating that we're actually starting to revert to trendline growth as e-commerce came about. You heard very early on in the first 3 months of the pandemic that about 10 years of conversion were compressed into a 3-month period of time. March, April, May, somewhat into June. You actually saw what had been trendline growth from physical retail into virtual retail, about 10 years of that trend compressed into 3 months. Well, now that we're 13 months into it, people are actually starting to go back to physical retail. So not all of the gains in e-commerce have been eroded, but you're starting to see that trend. The rate of the growth has slowed as people start reverting back to bricks and mortar. So that's one thing, and we're going to have to figure out, how rapidly e-commerce continues to take market share away from retail. I would say the other thing that's going on is that we actually learned a very important lesson in white collar in particular, that we can efficiently, without a hit to productivity, work from home. We never knew that before. I think the last time we talked, if you had told me back in March 2020 that there were going to be 50 million people who could be on Zoom calls all at the same time, I would say that the entire internet infrastructure would collapse.
Right.
Well, guess what? It's actually pretty durable, notwithstanding all the dings and knocks of Zoom calls where you have dropouts. it still worked, and you can actually measure that in white-collar productivity. The white collar is the ability to work from home. White collar tends to be able to afford broadband. It tends to be in more urbanized areas that has access to broadband. And if you take a look at broad metrics across lots of white-collar service sectors, consulting, law, delivery of architectural services, for example, for the most part, revenues and profits have actually gone up over the last year. Astoundingly, I work at a law firm. I think at the beginning of all of this, we were all holding our breath about what kind of massive reduction in services and billing collections we were going to experience. And guess what? It grew. We actually collected more. There was actually more legal services, and lawyers were actually more productive working from home than they were in the office. That has some pretty dramatic knock-on effects in terms of how commercial space users are going to think about their space needs going forward.
So let's talk about that just a second. When we think about commercial office space, we have seen so many stories of announcements from global companies, regional companies, saying, hey, we're sending our people home and they're not coming back. And this wasn't just as a response to the immediate threat of the pandemic, but has been ongoing since then. And even as things have started to relieve, we're still seeing these announcements come out that the reality is I don't need millions of square feet of space and millions of dollars of cost that I could eliminate when I'm seeing how efficient and how highly productive my workers are in this context. What does that mean, though, really, at the end of the day, to cities like New York or San Francisco or Chicago or Boston or Dallas, when you have tens of millions of square feet of space that is not going to revert back to butts and seats, as I call it? I don't think we're going to see 100% of the bodies come back to 100% of the space.
Absolutely, and we're a long way away from figuring out exactly how that plays out. And one of the challenges in measuring all of this in office space in particular is because any of those evolutionary or revolutionary changes in terms of how white collar office goers consume space, all of that is muted by the fact that the conventional lease agreement is a 10-year lease. So whether or not you have butts in seats next week or next month or next year, you still have that ongoing obligation. You entered into a 10-year lease obligation. So until you start turning over, until you come to a point where you're considering your options after lease termination, you're going to continue making that payment. And oh, by the way, those major tenants that have tried court challenging the enforceability of that lease obligation by invoking force majeure, they've lost.
Wow.
They've lost around the country. Everyone tried to assert that. The vast majority of courts said there is no force majeure that covers COVID, and it doesn't cover protection when you have a government-imposed shutdown. As a little asterisk, as new leases are being written by tenants, you're starting to see that protection built into new leases. That force majeure is specifically defined to include things like, I can't quietly enjoy my space as a consequence of the pandemic. Okay? But that's all new stuff. So we aren't going to see that play out for a long, long time if heaven forbid we ever face this kind of pandemic situation again. It's not going to have an influence.
So you were lucky if during this period, honestly, it's the luck of the draw as to whether your lease was coming to termination at this time. Otherwise, you're on the hook. And
you're stuck.
Yep. And
you're stuck.
There's nobody that wants to take sublease because, again, it's still the problem of people in seats.
Well, and when you take a look at the information coming out, and New York City is a great example because there actually are very good metrics out of New York City. When you take a look, we're approaching record levels of sublease available space in New York City. And when you can dig down to the economics of where current tenants are able to sublet that space, the experience that I'm familiar with is that they're taking about a 50% haircut. So I entered into a lease on Class A Central Business District at $70 a square foot. If I'm lucky and I can find someone to take some chunk of my space, I'm getting $35 a square foot.
So you're still on the hook for the cash flow. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are other little points where you take a look at corporate users, and a lot of the accounting firms and a lot of the major consolidated real estate service providers, CBRE, Cushman, Jones Lang LaSalle, are starting to do surveys. And what they're seeing is that all CFOs, all chief financial officers, they're typically saying the same thing. After staff, after wages and salaries, our second biggest expense is rent.
Yes.
Okay. And so the question isn't how much, it's not, are we going to abandon the office? And I'm glad that you premised the question the way that you did, because a lot of commentators will set up this very false straw man argument saying, well, of course, people aren't going to stop going into offices. No one with their right mind would ever say that office needs are going to go away. But at the margin, which is what affects values and affects future development plans, at the margin, what we're starting to see is that space users are taking between 10 and 20% less. Those fortunate tenants who are actually coming up and rolling over, that limited evidence, that limited pool of new tenants or re-tenants, is rolling over and giving back about 10 or 20% of their space. That may not sound like a lot. That's dramatic. When you look at the operating leverage of most office buildings, the notion that you would increase your vacancy rate by 10 or 15 points, or that you would have to market adjust that per square foot rent to make it attractive, could be quite debilitating. And for some, it may be fatal. For some over-leveraged building owners, it could be fatal.
Yeah, and cumulatively, that 10, 15% is millions of square feet of give back.
Absolutely. And then the other dynamic that's been commented on is when you take a look at it, if you pull the lens back, there's some pretty broad themes that come out of that. One of which is Freddie Mac today, Sam Cater, the economist, just came out and said that we're underhoused by about 3.8 million units. We've never had that kind of a housing gap before. That's single family housing. Multifamily housing is also underhoused. So we're under constructing residential, broadly speaking. When you take a look at the whole phenomenon of work from home and what makes it so appealing to chief financial officers and the C-suite at large companies that tend to be the large users of space, what they've done is take a rental obligation that the corporation or the company was shouldering and imposing that on their employees. Okay? So all of a sudden, the concept of micro houses and mini houses and working out of 1,200 square feet, there had been a long-term trend where the average size of homes was declining generationally. That started to reverse. Why? Because if I'm going to work from home, one, I would prefer to have a dedicated office space, but at a minimum, I don't want to feel like I'm incarcerated for 168 hours a week. So of course, my space needs are going to go up. That's putting enormous pressure on the housing stock in the country. So just like in retail, you're seeing the movement of a collapse in retail property values in favor of industrial, in favor of the fulfillment centers, the Amazon fulfillment centers. You're also seeing a shift from pressures on bringing to market new office, and the shift is now pressuring residential, because now your home is also your office. Maybe not 5 days a week. Maybe what emerges from this, and what seems to be the consensus view, when you survey employees and you survey employers about their willingness to engage with their employees on their preferences, The vast preference is hybrid.
Yep.
That I'm no longer going to go into the office 5 days a week. There are absolutely good collaborative reasons, cultural reasons why you have to be in the office. You might just not have to be in the office 5 days a week. So maybe you're in the office 3 days a week and you're at home for Thursday, Friday. There's going to be some kind of model like that that sets in. And I think people are actually going to get comfortable with that.
So back to, I have a couple of response questions to this. So that this idea where I'm still on the hook for my 10 or 15 year lease, right? I'm still on the hook even if nobody's occupying it. The reality is, at least my assumption is that an unoccupied space where I'm paying the flat monthly fee that I owe to the landlord is still lower than if I bring everyone in, because once I bring everyone back into the office, I have an escalating amount of consumables that are also they hit my budgets as well. So if it's a trade-off, I'm still going to leave the space empty from a pure financial standpoint. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think that's right. Those costs are overwhelmed by the $75 a square foot that you're paying anyway. But at the margin, absolutely, that's important. One of the other things, and this goes into another sector, when we talk about how behavior that has modified over the last 13 months, how much of that behavior is permanently changed? How much of the behavior is etched into the consciousness of corporate America and consumer America? So again, getting back to the chief financial officer, one of the things that the CFOs have looked at in terms of, can we reduce our space needs? The other thing that they've looked at is, oh my gosh, all of my travel and entertainment budget zeroed out this past year. And I really kind of like that.
Yeah.
So there's this back and forth now about how much travel, how much business travel is going to return and how quickly it's going to return. And the lodging analysts that I listen to are absolutely bifurcating lodging. There's leisure lodging, and there's drive-to resorts where you don't have to get on a plane, and that's actually done really well. A lot of those hotels, the drive-to hotels, the 2- and 3-star hotels, those haven't missed a beat for the most part. The 4, 4.5, 5-star hotels, the business traveler hotels, they continue to be pretty crushed. And even after we hit herd immunity, if that ever happens, there's still the appeal to the chief financial officer of looking at a reduced travel and entertainment budget. And that will persist, according to most lodging analysts, probably at least through 2024. At which point the sales force is going to start looking at the fact that, well, the guy who travels out to Indianapolis to ink that deal, he won business from me. And chief financial officer, you have to pay for me to go back out to Indianapolis because I'm being cannibalized. That's going to be, I don't know how long that's going to take.
Right.
But there is some chunk of business travel that's going to lag significantly. And business travel, business users are responsible for 70% of lodging revenues. So it's enormous. It's not like the leisure and the business roughly offset each other. That's not true. In terms of lodging revenues, it's very heavily skewed to the business traveler. So that's another question that we're going to have to see how rapidly we revert to the mean, or if we revert to the mean. So
let's ask a question real quickly here. You got into the question of housing, both single family and multifamily. The single family space is just unbelievable, the shortage of inventory that's out there. We have seen multifamily continue through the pandemic regionally. It depends on where that is. You would think that the cost of money, which is pretty cheap at this point, would have really spurred a giant resurgence of building, but we're still seeing a restraint on that in different parts of the country. Even though there's this unbelievable need and the money is pretty cheap, What are you reading from that as to why we're not just going crazy like we did in years earlier where we overbuilt? What is
that's true. What a strange inversion. You know, if you there's so many false parallels between what we've experienced in the great financial crisis. It's really, in a lot of ways, it's completely inapposite. But the paradox that you talked about is one of the most glaring, because I'll remind you that back in 2009, when the extent of housing overbuilding and overleveraging became apparent, the great Harvard economist Martin Feldstein said that we're under destroyed. We aren't overbuilt. We're under destroyed. He actually said the best thing. He said this in editorial in the Wall Street Journal. The best thing that we can do as a country is go through and destroy 1 million single-family homes to start getting the supply-demand back into equilibrium. Fast forward to where we are right now. What's happened in the last 12 or 13 years? A lot of stuff has happened. Housing, construction, financing availability has not been the problem, particularly because of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the government-sponsored enterprises that are still wards of the state. They're still under conservatorship, and they still have a $7.8 trillion debt imposed on the U.S. Treasury. But one of the good things about their existence is that financing housing has never abated. And even though they don't typically get into construction, the construction lenders, typically the commercial banks in this country, are loath to enter into a construction project where you don't have in place a Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae takeout at the end of that period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. So having that as a takeout for permanent financing has been a real lifeline and a real stability in terms of financing all of this. One of the initiatives, and we don't really have meat on the bones of this, but Biden has talked about how one of his initiatives is to look at local zoning to make that easier. I have a friend who's a home builder on starter homes, which is exactly the part of the market where we need. We don't need $2 million mini mansions. We need $300,000 starter homes. And he tells me, and he's an Atlanta area developer, he tells me that the zoning regulatory costs are about $50,000 to $60,000 per home.
Wow.
I haven't traced that. That's enormous when you're talking about a $250,000 home. And it's another reason why home builders have looked at land values, which have escalated phenomenally, and essentially fixed cost of zoning and regulation, and said, I can spread that cost a lot more easily on $1 million home than I can on a $300,000 home.
Yep.
Therefore, and that's where the margins are for me. If I'm Toll Brothers or Lennar, pick your Pulte, pick your favorite home builder, they're migrating up market because that's where the profits are. They have not figured out an easy way to make the same profits on a $250,000, $300,000 starter home.
It's a problem. Affordable housing across the country continues to be a crisis, I think, for many Americans. I'm going to change our trajectory here. What are we seeing as far as debt defaults across commercial real estate? I know there was a lot of mess going on the hospitality side. Anything of consequence that we should speak of in the commercial office space? Are debt defaults driving an underground tsunami that will appear later? What's happening on that side?
David, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I just participated yesterday in a half-day session on distressed debt in CRE. And I can tell you that if you add up all of the debt funds that have been established to take advantage of this distressed debt opportunity, according to some measures, there's about $250 billion worth of dedicated funds that have been raised to address all of the debt problems. If you take a look at CoStar, Their expectation is that over the next 12 months, we're going to see something around $200 billion in distress. We haven't seen it yet. We've seen very, very little of this coming out. And I always trace it back to the motivation of the lenders. The lenders are the ones that set the timetable on defaulting, as opposed to trying to do a workout. So we've seen, if we roll the clock back to March, April, when the world was completely foggy, one of the things that everyone did, all lending sources, the GSEs that we talked about before essentially said we aren't going to pursue any kind of creditors' remedies, foreclosure, defaults, at least until 2021. They pushed it all the way out 9 months, and then they kind of continued with that mantra. When you take a look at CMBS, the servicing industry essentially gave the vast majority of defaulted borrowers across all property types forbearance periods. They had to take a look at each request individually, but the experience in the rearview mirror is that almost everyone, unless you approach the lender in bad faith, got some kind of forbearance. It's either a 3-month or a 6-month forbearance. And at the end of that, and the world hadn't cleared, unfortunately, 3 or 6 months later, go ahead and take an extra 3 months. So, and the commercial banks, which is the largest provider of finance to commercial real estate, they're responsible for about over 50% of the $4.8 trillion in commercial mortgage debt outstanding. And the bank regulators, the macro-prudential regulators, essentially said, take your time, don't pressure your borrowers. All of the accounting and classification that puts pressure on your capital ratios, don't worry about that, at least through the end of 2020. Okay, so up until now, the entire lending community has essentially, I would say, kick the can down the road. That's a pejorative. I don't mean it that way. I think it was purposeful, it was generous, but it's also right-minded. It's the right thing to do. These loans were defaulting through no fault at all of the borrower or any kind of deficiency at the property level. It's just that the economy was shut down. Now we're in a different world. And what we're going to see is there are going to be survivors and there are going to be losers. As the economic landscape really opens up and the sky's clear, we're going to say, to paraphrase Warren Buffett's phrase, who's been swimming without a swimsuit?
Yeah, right.
And a lot of those properties that have been caught out and are not recovering, they're going to go away. And there are going to be a lot of them, but that hasn't really started in earnest yet. I think that's going to be a second half 2021 issue.
That's where it begins, and it will roll into 2022. And therefore, when we look at all of the, we'll call it optimism at this point about the recovery of the economy and all things positive, Americans are usually focused, shiny objects. Oh, it's going this way. Everything's good. When there's a delay factor on some of these deep economic problems that will come, the banks, even though they're being wonderful to give forbearance, their pro formas are now impacted over the long run as a result of this delay. They're not going to be able to claw all that back over time.
No, the commercial banks, when you take a look, and we're just entering into earnings season for first quarter, and we're seeing profits that have, in some cases, quintupled quarter on quarter against first quarter last year. A lot of that is artificial because first quarter 2020, when you roll the clock back, there was massive loan loss provisions that the banks, out of conservatism, were saying, we have no idea what the level of default is going to be across our entire portfolio, commercial and consumer. We have no idea. What's happening now is that with the skies opening up again, a lot of those reserves are being taken back into income.
So that inflates everything as far as your performance. Yeah. So
it inflates everything. But going into this, and this is another huge difference between what we went through, the very, very short recession, even though it hasn't been officially dated. This could be this could be turn out to be a one-quarter recession that doesn't even meet the textbook definition of NBER's recession for 2 declining quarters. We had just this massive drop in second quarter, 33% down. We've never seen anything like that rapidly. We've also never seen a recovery in the third quarter that recovered 31% on GDP. So we never saw, talk about a V. It was a very deep down, a very quick V up. But the other thing that makes this different from the other recessions that we've lived through is that we went into this and the financial sector was not over leveraged. The commercial banks had never been so well capitalized. Yeah. They effectively had capital to burn. So when they needed to allocate for loan loss provisions, it didn't really impair their capital positions at all. We've had not even a handful of bank failures through this crisis, as opposed to 510 banks that failed through the great financial crisis.
So lastly, let's talk about the specter that's hanging out there called inflation. The Fed has taken on an unbelievable amount of debt, and that never really got paid down through the quantitative easement period of the prior administrations. And so we look at where we are today. How do we get out of this debt? Do we care? And what does that mean to the future of U.S. economics when it comes to inflationary pressure?
It's such a great question. And when you follow as many economists as I do, it's so interesting to see this complete schism from one side to the other. And one of the defining characteristics is thinking about the ratio of debt to GDP. I think we've had drilled into our heads through the decades that you needed to be very mindful of that ratio. Yeah. So right now, for the first time since 1946, that debt to GDP ratio is set to exceed 100%. So the GDP in rough numbers, all the value of goods and services that this country creates is about $21.5 trillion. It's still a little bit below where we were fourth quarter 2019. But over this summer, the economists are predicting we will hit a new record in GDP sometime over the summer. So if you have about 100% debt to GDP, so we've got about $21.5 trillion of debt. Most of the time, it's kind of a strange ratio when you think about it, because if you're at all familiar with financial statements, you have an income statement and you have a balance sheet. So if I made $50,000 last year, that's my income statement, and I spent $45,000 and I saved $5,000. That's my income statement. My balance sheet is I own my home, I own my car, I've got a mortgage against it, and you subtract out the value of everything that I own from what I owe on everything, and that's my net worth. Okay, that ratio, that debt to GDP ratio, is comparing a balance sheet item with an income statement item. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so it doesn't quite fit. So again, if you want to reduce it to a level of an individual, let's say that I have a $400,000 home and I have a $300,000 mortgage on it, and I make $75,000 a year. The equivalent debt to GDP ratio would say my debt to income ratio is 400%. Crazy, yeah. If you take a look, now compare it against what the experience of other countries is. So Japan, for example, is at the high water mark, very, very bad league table, which is debt to GDP. Japan is at 230%. Do they have inflation? They have no inflation. They want inflation. They've been trying to generate inflation for 30 years, unsuccessfully. So when you take a look at what the Fed's new policy is looking at, they're actually mindful of the fact that people have been crying wolf with respect to inflation ever since Ronald Reagan was in office. and we haven't seen it. And in fact, the preferred metric that the Fed uses, which is personal consumption expenditures, they want it to hit 2%. It has been running about 1.5, 1.6%. The whole change in the policy of the Fed, as stated by Jay Powell and the other members of the Open Market Committee, have been, we've always wanted to keep it under our target. We need to let it run hot. And that's where a lot of economists are running scared right now, because the economists don't have confidence that if they're running hot, so we're running 2.5%, we've exceeded the 2%, which the Fed describes as a transitory risk. A lot of economists are saying, you can't control whether it's transitory or permanent. You can't control that. Once it's out of control, it's out of control. We'll see. The Fed thinks that they can allow it to run hot, and then they can kind of ease down on all the pressures. The money supply growth will decline. The size of the balance sheet will decline. Bank reserves will decline, and we'll be able to kind of ease back to where we want it to get to. This is a big experiment running on a $21.5 trillion economy. The Fed has an $8 trillion balance sheet right now, on its way to probably $10 trillion. So it's an experiment. We'll figure this out, but at least for the foreseeable future, the short, medium term, the next 1-2 years, I don't think most people think that we're going to see embedded inflation as a concern. You take a look at the 10-year Treasury note, the best market indicator, and it's actually compressed significantly from where it was last month. It hit 174. This morning it's at 157. So the market is completely at ease, absorbing these trillions of dollars of new deficits.
Yeah, fantastic. This has been a great conversation and a great input to all of our greater thinking that as we're looking to the future. This SuperCast that we're doing is really focused on lessons learned, permanent changes, and projections into the future. And you've really given us a great view into all that. So thanks, Brian, for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Always enjoy it, Dave.